"You held HOA meetings in my lake house?" I asked, keeping my voice calm as I stood outside the wide picture window overlooking the water. No one inside heard me. They were too busy applauding Constance Holloway as she stood at my stone fireplace with a clipboard in one hand and a coffee mug in the other, speaking as if she owned every inch of the room. Nearly 24 people filled the chairs I had bought years earlier. Someone had plugged a projector into my outlet. A folding table covered my handmade oak dining table to protect it from coffee spills. They had even taped an HOA agenda to the wall beside a framed photograph of my late wife, without asking who had placed that photograph there or why it mattered. I simply watched from outside beneath the shade of the old white oak that had stood beside the lake longer than any of those homes had existed. The breeze carried the smell of fresh water, pine, and charcoal from a nearby grill, but beneath it lingered the faint scent of burnt coffee drifting through my open kitchen vent. It would have been peaceful if I hadn't been staring at strangers treating my private lake house like the neighborhood clubhouse. My name is Graham Whitaker. I'm 56 years old, retired after 32 years as a structural engineer, and I've learned something important about people who believe they can take what belongs to someone else. They rarely stop because someone argues with them. They stop when reality quietly closes every door they thought would always stay open. I bought this lake house 12 years earlier after my wife, Emily, convinced me that everyone deserved one place in the world where life could finally slow down. We spent countless weekends watching bald eagles circle above the lake, drinking coffee on the back deck before sunrise, listening to waves tap gently against the dock. After cancer took her, I couldn't bear to sell the place. It wasn't just property anymore. It was the last place where every room still carried memories I wasn't ready to lose. That's why I visited only a few weekends each month. Apparently, Constance noticed. Constance Holloway had been president of the Willow Ridge HOA for almost 7 years. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed every neatly trimmed lawn and freshly painted mailbox existed because of her personal leadership. Around the neighborhood, she liked to say that community spaces belonged to everyone. The only problem was that my lake house had never been a community space. It sat outside HOA property lines, listed separately on county records, protected by its own deed, and paid for entirely by me. None of that seemed to matter anymore. Through the glass, I watched Constance point toward my fireplace, while several board members nodded and laughed. One man walked into my kitchen and opened my refrigerator without hesitation. Another carried snacks onto my back deck, where my wife's wind chimes still swayed gently above the railing. They looked completely comfortable, as though this routine had been happening for months. Then I noticed something that made me stop breathing for just a second. Hanging from Constance's key ring was a silver key with a blue plastic tag. It looked exactly like the emergency spare key I had hidden inside a locked compartment years ago. I didn't interrupt the meeting. I didn't knock on the door. I simply smiled, turned away from the window, and walked quietly back toward my truck because in that single moment I realized this wasn't the beginning of my problem. It was the beginning of theirs. I drove away without saying a single word because anger has a way of ruining good plans. By the time I reached the county road, I already knew exactly what I was not going to do. I was not going to call Constance. I was not going to post anything on social media. I was not going to march back inside demanding answers in front of 20 witnesses who already believed they belonged there. People like Constance thrived on confrontation because every argument became another story they could rewrite later. Evidence, on the other hand, had no emotions and no imagination. It simply told the truth. 3 days later, almost the entire HOA board would find themselves sitting inside that same lake house waiting for deputies and a property manager to verify why they had been conducting official meetings inside a private residence without permission. None of them would be injured. None of them would even be threatened. They would simply discover that ownership carries certain rights, especially when those rights are documented correctly. But before that day arrived, I needed to understand how this had happened in the first place. I returned home that evening and unlocked the small fireproof cabinet in my office where every document related to the lake house had been stored for years. The deed was exactly where it had always been. The county survey maps were untouched. The property tax receipts were paid through the current year. The insurance policy clearly identified the building as a privately owned seasonal residence completely outside the jurisdiction of Willow Ridge Homeowners Association. There was no easement allowing public access, no shared facility agreement, no lease, no maintenance contract. Legally speaking, the house belonged to exactly one person, me. That left only one question. How had an entire board convinced itself otherwise? I opened my laptop and began searching through months of neighborhood newsletters, archived meeting minutes, and community emails. Around midnight, I found something interesting. Buried inside an announcement about landscaping volunteers was a single sentence thanking Constance for securing a beautiful lakeside meeting location for future board gatherings. There was no address listed, no owner's name, just the phrase secured for community use. I read it 3 times before leaning back in my chair. That sentence was not proof of permission. It was proof that someone wanted everyone else to assume permission already existed. Assumptions become dangerous when nobody bothers asking questions. The next morning, I called Harold Benson, the retired caretaker who inspected the Lakehouse once each month whenever I was traveling. Harold answered on the second ring with his usual cheerful voice. Before I could finish explaining what I had seen, he became unusually quiet. Finally, he sighed and admitted that he had noticed unfamiliar vehicles parked near the house several times over the past 6 months. He assumed I had rented the place for private events because the visitors carried folders, laptops, and name badges instead of fishing poles or coolers. He never entered the property because everything always appeared orderly when they left. Nothing seemed broken. Nothing looked stolen. They simply arrived, stayed for a few hours, and disappeared again. That bothered me more than if they had left the place in complete disarray. They had become so comfortable that they acted like responsible owners instead of unauthorized guests. Before ending the call, Harold mentioned one final detail that made everything suddenly fit together. A local locksmith had visited the property the previous fall because someone claimed they needed an extra emergency key for official community business. Harold remembered the truck because he had stopped to wave as he drove past. I thanked him, wrote down the date, and stared out my office window for a long moment. I no longer wondered whether Constance believed she had the right to use my lake house. I was beginning to suspect she had spent months making sure everyone else believed it too. The locksmith's name was printed on the side of the invoice Harold helped me track down the following afternoon. Lakeshore Lock and Key had been serving 3 counties for almost 30 years, and the owner, Martin Ellis, still answered his own office phone. I introduced myself, explained that I owned the lake house, and asked whether he remembered doing any work there the previous fall. There was a brief silence while computer keys clicked in the background. Then Martin said something that immediately confirmed my suspicions. Yes, Mr. Whitaker, I remember that property because the woman requesting service insisted she represented the community association. She said the board had authorization to maintain an emergency access key in case of storms or medical situations. Martin explained that he had refused to make a new key until someone produced proof of ownership. According to his records, the request was never completed because no ownership documents were provided. I thanked him for his honesty, but before hanging up, I asked one more question. Had anyone else contacted him afterward? He answered no. That meant the key I saw hanging from Constance's ring had come from somewhere else entirely. Someone had copied my spare key without my knowledge. That discovery should have made me furious. Instead, it made me careful. People can argue over misunderstandings. They have a much harder time explaining copied keys. Later that afternoon, I drove back toward the lake, parking half a mile away near the public boat launch instead of pulling into my own driveway. The air smelled like warm cedar and fresh-cut grass, and fishing boats drifted lazily across the water under a bright blue sky. From a distance, the lake house looked exactly the way Emily and I had left it years ago. White siding reflected the afternoon sun. The wraparound porch overlooked the quiet shoreline. Wind chimes still moved gently beneath the eaves. It looked peaceful enough that no one passing by would ever guess strangers had slowly turned it into an unofficial headquarters. I spent nearly 2 hours observing from across the cove with a pair of binoculars I normally used for birdwatching. Around 4 o'clock, 2 sport utility vehicles arrived, followed by a pickup truck carrying folding tables. Several people unlocked my front door as naturally as neighbors walking into a public library. They laughed, carried boxes inside, and arranged chairs without the slightest hesitation. Nobody paused to wonder whether they should be there. Confidence is a remarkable thing when it goes unchallenged long enough. I quietly photographed every vehicle, every arrival, and every departure, recording timestamps the same way I had documented construction projects throughout my career. Old habits become valuable when facts matter more than opinions. Before sunset, I walked down the shoreline until I reached the neighboring property owned by Walter and Denise Crawford, a retired couple who had lived beside the lake for almost 15 years. They greeted me warmly and invited me onto their dock for iced tea. During our conversation, Denise casually mentioned that the board seemed to enjoy my place because it was larger than the neighborhood clubhouse. She assumed I had volunteered it for community use. When I gently explained that I had never given anyone permission, both of them stared at me in disbelief. Walter slowly shook his head before telling me that the meetings had become so routine, people referred to the building as the Lake Lodge. That nickname spread because Constance introduced it during neighborhood events until everyone accepted it as fact. In less than a year, she had managed to replace ownership with assumption. Driving home that evening, I realized I was no longer dealing with a single unauthorized meeting. I was dealing with months of carefully cultivated appearances, and appearances have a way of collapsing the moment undeniable evidence finally arrives. By the beginning of the following week, I had stopped asking whether Constance believed her own story. That question no longer mattered. The important question was how many other people had accepted it without ever checking the facts. I spent the next several days building a timeline the same way I used to organize engineering reports. Every photograph received a timestamp. Every email was saved in chronological order. Every conversation was written down before memory had a chance to smooth over the details. I even drove to the county recorder's office and requested fresh certified copies of my deed, property survey, and tax records. The clerk behind the counter smiled when she handed me the stamped documents and joked that nobody was more organized than retired engineers. I smiled back because organization was about to become my greatest advantage. That Thursday, I quietly attended an open HOA meeting at the neighborhood clubhouse instead of the Lakehouse. I sat in the last row wearing a plain baseball cap while Constance worked through landscaping approvals, fence applications, and budget updates with the confidence of someone who had never been questioned. Then she reached the final agenda item. She announced that the next executive planning session would once again be held at the Lake Lodge because it offered a better environment for board discussions. She said those words so naturally that nobody in the room even looked surprised. Several homeowners nodded in agreement. One woman commented that the lake house always felt more welcoming than the clubhouse. Another thanked Constance for making such a beautiful place available to the community. Constance accepted the compliments with an appreciative smile, never correcting a single assumption. She never said she owned the property. She never claimed she had written permission. She simply allowed everyone else to fill in the missing pieces themselves. That was the moment I understood her strategy. She rarely made direct statements that could easily be disproved. Instead, she carefully encouraged conclusions that benefited her while leaving just enough ambiguity to deny responsibility later. On my way out, I spoke briefly with Gary Nelson, one of the newer board members whom I barely knew. He mentioned that he appreciated the larger meeting space because the board had almost outgrown the clubhouse. When I casually asked who had arranged access to the lake house, he shrugged and replied that Constance had always handled those details. He assumed everything had been approved long before he joined the board. Assumptions again. Every conversation seemed to end at the same place. Nobody had actually seen permission. Everyone simply believed someone else had. The following afternoon, I visited the lake house once more, this time using my own key to enter after confirming the property was empty. Nothing appeared damaged, but small details told a different story. Fresh coffee stains marked the kitchen counter. Folding chairs had left faint impressions across the hardwood floor. Someone had moved Emily's favorite reading chair closer to the fireplace to create additional seating. A stack of disposable cups filled one corner of the pantry, and my guest bathroom contained a package of paper towels I had never purchased. The house still looked clean, yet it no longer felt untouched. It felt borrowed by people who had forgotten they were guests. Standing in the quiet living room, I listened to the gentle waves tapping against the dock outside and noticed something almost hidden beneath the television cabinet. A small adhesive cable clip had been attached to the wood to organize projector wires. Someone had modified my home to make future meetings more convenient. I slowly peeled the plastic clip away, placed it in a small evidence bag, and slipped it into my folder with everything else. The board thought they were preparing for another routine gathering. They had no idea I was preparing for something entirely different. And for the first time since this strange situation began, every piece of the puzzle was finally starting to fit together. The more I documented, the less emotional the situation became. It turned into a puzzle with missing pieces, and puzzles reward patience instead of outrage. The following Monday, I met with my attorney, Rebecca Lawson, a real estate lawyer I had worked with years earlier when I purchased the Lakehouse. Her office overlooked the county courthouse, and the waiting room carried the familiar scent of old books and freshly brewed coffee. Rebecca spent nearly an hour reviewing my photographs, county records, email archives, and handwritten timeline without interrupting. When she finally leaned back in her chair, she smiled in a way that immediately told me she had reached a conclusion. She pointed to the deed first. Then she tapped the property survey. Finally, she rested her hand on the folder containing my photographs. "Graham," she said, "this is not an HOA dispute. This is a private property issue. The board has no authority here unless you voluntarily gave it to them. And from everything I have seen, you never did." Hearing those words confirmed what I already suspected, but I wanted to know something more important. I asked whether confronting the board immediately would be the smartest option. Rebecca shook her head. She explained that once people realized they had crossed a legal boundary, they often changed their stories, deleted messages, or claimed misunderstandings. Right now, they believed everything they were doing was normal. That confidence was preserving the evidence better than any court order ever could. She advised me to make no announcements, issue no warnings, and avoid any action that might encourage them to alter their routine before I fully understood it. Then she asked a simple question. "Do they have another meeting scheduled?" I nodded and showed her the printed HOA agenda listing the executive planning session for the following Thursday afternoon. Rebecca circled the date with her pen. "Good," she replied. "Let them follow their own schedule." Before leaving, she recommended upgrading every lock on the property because homeowners are always entitled to secure access to their own residence. She emphasized that any changes should comply with local building codes and fire safety requirements, and that every entry system should function exactly as designed. That distinction mattered. We were protecting private property, not creating danger for anyone. I spent the next 2 days meeting with a licensed security company that specialized in smart home systems for seasonal residences. Their technician, Miguel Alvarez, walked through every room with me, inspecting doors, windows, and existing hardware. We selected commercial-grade electronic deadbolts connected to a central security panel with remote monitoring, automatic logging, and emergency override functions. Miguel explained that every lock activation would generate an exact timestamp, every door opening would be recorded, and every authorized code would be stored in a permanent digital history. Listening to him describe the system felt strangely satisfying because I realized the house itself was about to become an impartial witness. It would remember everything whether people wanted it to or not. Installation began the very next morning while the property remained completely empty. By sunset, every exterior door had been upgraded, every access point had been tested repeatedly, and every emergency release function had passed inspection. I stood alone on the back deck watching the last orange lights settle across the lake while loons called somewhere in the distance. The water was perfectly still, almost reflective enough to mirror the clouds above it. Inside the house, everything looked exactly the same as before. The furniture had not moved. The photographs remained on the walls. Emily's reading chair sat beside the fireplace exactly where I had returned it. Nothing appeared different to anyone walking through the front door. That was precisely the point. Sometimes the strongest plan is the one nobody notices until it has already begun to work. Wednesday evening arrived with the kind of quiet that only exists near a lake after sunset. The air carried the clean scent of pine needles mixed with cool water drifting across the dock, and the only sounds came from distant tree frogs and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. I parked several hundred yards away again, choosing the same overlook where I had spent the previous week documenting every visit. From there I could see the lights glowing warmly inside the lake house. At exactly 6:15, the first sport utility vehicle pulled into the driveway. By 6:30, 8 vehicles occupied spaces that belonged to no one except me. The new security system quietly recorded every arrival while I watched through binoculars. One by one, they walked inside carrying binders, coffee, pastries, and laptop bags. They smiled, greeted one another, and settled into my living room with the relaxed confidence of people following a familiar routine. Constance arrived last. She stepped out of her white crossover vehicle carrying the same leather portfolio and the same silver key ring I had noticed days earlier. This time I watched carefully as she reached my front door. Instead of trying several keys, she immediately selected the blue-tagged key and unlocked the deadbolt in one smooth motion. She had clearly used it many times before. I photographed the entire sequence, noting the exact time displayed by my camera. The security application on my phone simultaneously recorded that an unauthorized mechanical key had opened the front door. That single notification completed the timeline I had been building. There was no misunderstanding anymore. Someone had duplicated my emergency key and had been using it regularly without my knowledge or permission. Inside, the meeting began exactly as it had before. Through the living room windows, I could see charts projected onto the wall beside Emily's photograph. Coffee cups rested on my dining table. Someone opened the patio doors to enjoy the evening breeze. Another board member carried refreshments from my kitchen as though everything inside the house belonged equally to everyone present. It was remarkable how ordinary, extraordinary behavior can begin to feel once nobody questions it. I remained outside for nearly an hour, allowing the security logs, exterior cameras, and my own photographs to document the evening naturally. Shortly after 7:30, my phone vibrated with a message from Rebecca. She asked only one question: "Is everyone there?" I counted twice before replying. Every voting board member listed on the HOA website appeared to be inside the house along with 2 guests and the property manager. Rebecca responded a few seconds later. "Good. Continue exactly as planned." I slipped the phone back into my pocket and walked quietly toward the shoreline until I reached the small boathouse, where the wireless control panel had the strongest signal. The moon reflected across the calm water like polished silver, and a cool breeze rustled the reeds along the edge of the dock. Standing there, I opened the security application Miguel had installed only days earlier. Every exterior door displayed a green status indicator. Every emergency safety feature remained active. Every digital log was recording normally. My thumb hovered over one simple command that would place the property into its standard secured mode, the same setting homeowners routinely use whenever they need to protect an occupied residence until authorized personnel verify access. I looked back at the softly lit windows one final time. They still believed they were attending another ordinary meeting. They had absolutely no idea that within the next few moments, every assumption they had relied upon for months was about to collide with documented ownership, and no amount of confidence could unlock what the law recognized as mine. My thumb pressed the secure mode button, and the confirmation message appeared almost instantly. Every exterior lock cycled exactly as Miguel had demonstrated during installation. Green indicators turned blue one after another, confirming the house had entered protected occupancy mode. The system was designed for seasonal homes, allowing authorized personnel to verify access before anyone entered or exited during an active security event. It did exactly what it had been certified to do. Nothing more, nothing less. Inside the Lakehouse, nobody noticed the change at first. The meeting continued for several more minutes while I stood quietly beside the dock listening to the gentle hum of insects and the soft creaking of the wooden pilings beneath the water. Then my phone displayed another notification. Rear patio door handle tested. No exit authorized. A few seconds later, another message appeared. Front entry handle tested. Access verification required. Through the living room windows, I could see several board members looking toward the front hallway with puzzled expressions. One man walked to the entrance, turned the handle, paused, then tried again. Another board member joined him, and within moments, several people gathered near the foyer speaking to one another with growing confusion. Constance remained remarkably calm. She walked to the front door herself, inserted the blue-tagged key into the lock, turned it once, then frowned when nothing changed. She tried again, slower this time, but the electronic deadbolt remained engaged exactly as it was programmed to do whenever secure occupancy mode was active. I watched her remove the key and stare at it for several seconds, as though it had somehow betrayed her. My phone rang. It was Rebecca. "Everything proceeding normally?" she asked. I answered yes and described exactly what I was seeing without exaggeration. She reminded me of the next step. Contact the monitoring center, identify myself as the homeowner, report unauthorized use of the residence, and request standard access verification through local authorities. That was precisely why the security company included 24-hour monitoring. I called immediately. After confirming my identity through multiple security questions, I explained that individuals were occupying my private residence without my permission and that the property had automatically entered protected mode. The operator remained calm and professional. She confirmed that the digital log showed repeated unauthorized key access over several weeks, verified that I was listed as the sole owner, and informed me that deputies had been requested to assist with identity verification before the system would be reset. Nothing about the conversation sounded dramatic because it was not. It was simply procedure. Back inside the Lakehouse, the mood had changed completely. Through the windows, I saw people checking their phones, peering through the glass, and talking much faster than before. One board member looked genuinely embarrassed while another appeared more confused than concerned. Constance continued trying to project confidence, gesturing with both hands as though reassuring everyone that the situation would be resolved within minutes. Then one of the exterior cameras sent a live alert to my phone showing 2 sheriff's department vehicles slowly entering the driveway with their emergency lights inactive. The deputies parked neatly beside the other vehicles and stepped out without urgency, carrying clipboards instead of rushing toward the house. Their calm arrival told me everything I needed to know. This was no longer a neighborhood misunderstanding or an HOA disagreement. It had become a straightforward question of property ownership, documented access, and lawful authority, and for the first time since Constance walked into my Lakehouse months earlier, she was about to answer those questions in front of people who cared far more about records than assumptions. The deputies did not rush toward the front door. They spoke briefly with the monitoring center through their patrol vehicle, confirmed the property address, and then walked calmly onto the porch. One deputy pressed the doorbell, while the other waited with a small clipboard tucked beneath his arm. A moment later, several faces appeared through the glass panels beside the entrance. Even from my position near the shoreline, I could see the confusion spreading across the room. The deputy held up his badge, identified himself, and asked the occupants to remain calm while ownership of the residence was verified. Nobody appeared frightened. They simply looked surprised that a routine board meeting had suddenly become an official property inquiry. The monitoring center called me again to confirm I was prepared to meet the deputies with documentation. I told them I was already on my way. As I walked up the gravel driveway, I carried a single folder containing certified copies of my deed, county survey, tax records, insurance policy, and identification. The evening air had cooled noticeably, and the smell of fresh water mixed with the faint aroma of coffee drifting from inside the house. The same house that had once been filled only with quiet weekends and family memories now held a room full of people waiting to discover how badly they had misunderstood the situation. One of the deputies greeted me politely and asked whether I was Graham Whitaker. After confirming my identity, I handed him the folder without saying anything about Constance or the HOA. He reviewed the documents carefully, comparing parcel numbers and addresses before nodding to his partner. They contacted County Dispatch, verified the ownership records electronically, and within a few minutes, everything matched exactly. The residence belonged solely to me. It had never been listed as HOA property, community property, or shared recreational space. The deputy thanked me, then turned toward the front entrance where Constance was now speaking through the closed glass door with visible confidence. Although I could not hear every word, I watched her gesture toward the meeting room as if explaining that everything was simply a misunderstanding. The deputy listened patiently before asking one question that immediately changed the expression on several faces inside. He asked whether anyone present could provide written authorization from the property owner allowing recurring use of the residence for official HOA business. Papers shuffled. Several board members looked toward Constance instead of answering. She opened her leather portfolio, searched through several folders, removed a few printed agendas, and continued looking. The silence grew longer with every passing second. Finally, she shook her head slightly and said something I could not hear. The deputy remained courteous. He explained that assumptions, verbal understandings, or neighborhood traditions could not replace permission from the legal owner when private property was involved. He then informed everyone that once the monitoring center completed its verification procedure, the security system would be reset by the homeowner and the occupants could leave normally. While they waited, another deputy quietly photographed the copied key Constance had been using and asked where it had come from. She hesitated before admitting she had received it from a former volunteer who claimed it was available for board convenience years earlier. Nobody seemed able to identify exactly who had duplicated it or when. That answer only reinforced what my documentation had already shown. This entire arrangement had been built on assumptions that nobody had ever bothered to verify. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the trees, the monitoring center confirmed the verification process was complete. The deputy looked toward me and asked one simple question. "Mr. Whitaker, are you ready to restore access to your home?" I looked through the front windows at the room that had quietly become someone else's meeting place for months, opened the security application on my phone, and finally prepared to end the illusion that had lasted far longer than it ever should have. I pressed the Restore Access button, and one by one the status indicators on my phone returned to normal. The electronic locks disengaged with a quiet click that echoed through the front hallway. The deputy opened the door first, stepped aside, and politely invited everyone to leave after collecting their personal belongings. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, just an uncomfortable silence that seemed to grow heavier with every person who walked past me carrying binders, coffee mugs, and laptop bags that suddenly looked very out of place. Several board members avoided eye contact entirely. Others quietly apologized as they passed, explaining they honestly believed the house had been made available for official use years earlier. I believed most of them. They had trusted the wrong person, and trust has a way of spreading faster than facts. Constance came out last, still holding the silver key with the blue tag. One deputy asked if she would voluntarily surrender it while the copied key was documented as part of the incident report. She hesitated for only a moment before placing it into an evidence envelope. Without that key hanging from her hand, she looked noticeably less certain than the woman I had watched confidently leading meetings beside my fireplace only an hour earlier. Before leaving, she quietly told the deputies she never intended to cause harm and believed the arrangement benefited the community. The deputy answered with calm professionalism that intentions did not replace ownership, and that private property required permission from the legal owner regardless of how useful it might seem. It was probably the shortest lesson on property rights anyone in that room would ever receive, yet it carried more weight than months of HOA meetings. Over the following weeks, the story spread through Willow Ridge far more quickly than I ever expected. Once homeowners learned the complete timeline, many were genuinely shocked. They had assumed I had donated the Lakehouse for community use because that was the impression they had been given. Several neighbors personally stopped by to apologize for never asking whether the arrangement was real. Walter and Denise even brought over a homemade peach pie one Saturday afternoon, insisting they should have questioned the situation much sooner. During the next HOA election, nearly every board position was challenged for the first time in years. Homeowners requested clearer procedures, written approvals for every community event, and complete transparency regarding the use of any private property. Constance chose not to seek another term as president. The copied key was never returned because it never belonged to anyone except the locksmith who had originally cut the legitimate spare years before. I had every exterior lock rekeyed once more, updated the security codes, and installed a small bronze plaque beside the front entrance that simply read, "Private Family Residence." It was not there to keep good neighbors away. It was there to remind everyone that assumptions should never replace respect. A month later, I finally spent an entire weekend alone at the Lakehouse for the first time in what felt like forever. I brewed coffee before sunrise, carried the mug onto the back deck, and watched the morning mist drift slowly across the water exactly as Emily and I used to do. The wind chimes moved gently above me. The dock creaked softly with each passing wave, and somewhere across the lake a bald eagle circled in complete silence. Nothing about the view had changed. Only the peace had returned. Standing there, I realized something that every homeowner eventually learns. Protecting your property is never really about buildings, locks, or deeds. It is about protecting the memories, the boundaries, and the quiet places that make a house worth calling your own. And sometimes the most satisfying victory is not watching someone else lose. It is simply closing your own front door, knowing that everyone on the other side finally understands why it matters.